John SHARRATT. I'm with Hootsuite, security architect, but the views here expressed are my own. Is that still a bit loud for you guys? Everyone's good? Okay. All right. So I want you to realize that you've entered a bit of a different world. I call it GARLAND, or the land of Gar. So a lot of the speakers here are here because they're experts. I'm an expert because, I'm here because I'm not an expert. I thought that identity, I still think, identity, authentication, very interesting subjects, and I wanted to learn more about them. And I thought this was a good opportunity for me to have that kind of forced learning. And now I want to share that with you guys. So what I want to do is essentially survey the whole space, a lot of it anyway, of authentication, a little bit of identity, and leave you with a foundation, a way of looking at the space and understanding what's going on, especially with passwords, but also with authentication in general. And I have to say I'm pretty grateful to be able to speak to you here today. So I normally cringe when speakers do polls, but in this case, it's appropriate. I want to start you thinking about some of the issues. So here, number one. How many of you think that passwords are bad? Hands up, please. Okay. All right. Number two. How many of you would like to get rid of all passwords? Okay, a few. Less than I expected. This is good. And how many of you think it's possible to get rid of all passwords? Okay. You guys are going to be a good audience. Okay, so I spent a lot of time reading and reading and reading after this presentation was accepted for BSides. And I knew I had a problem when the document I collected with all my thoughts came to about 36 pages. So that's 36 pages of a Word document, small print. So you can imagine that trying to condense this down into a 45-minute talk is a bit of a challenge. I hope I'll do it justice. So the topic is, the title, Weaning the World Off Passwords. So what does weaning mean? Weaning is only for mammals. It's essentially the idea of taking an infant of that mammal, getting it onto adult food, getting it away from its mother's milk. And if you've spent any time on a farm, like I have, you know that weaning is quite a distressing process. And it's distressing for not only the service provider, but also the user. So passwords are going to be the same way. It's going to be distressful to get rid of them. It'll be disruptive, but I'm going to show you why there's hope. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all spaces. I'm try to cover enterprise, business to consumer, and also the personal space as well. So passwords started a long time ago, probably the beginning of human civilization, certainly organized civilization. But in IT, passwords started with time sharing in the 1960s. The idea being that a user, you'd authenticate yourself to the mainframe. Quite a different situation as today. Now, passwords are a form of authentication. And authentication's always been a game of cat and mouse. There's the bad guys fighting the good guys, new ideas on one side, opposing ideas on the other side. The whole subject of identity, authentication, fascinating areas, and I've become more and more interested as I've gotten into them, and I encourage you to go do some research as well. To start you off with a very, very simple view, you can look at identification as using a user ID to assert an identity. And then after that, you can look at authentication as using a password or something to prove that identity. Now that's a highly simplified view, but it's a good place to start. So there's a whole bunch of things wrong with passwords. Let's start. One of the major ones is that passwords push responsibility onto users that they're simply not prepared to handle, and they do not want that responsibility. So they find it really hard to manage them. You have to keep those passwords secret, you have to store them for a long period of time, and of course users can't really create and generate good quality passwords, and they can't create and generate and use and store unique passwords across all sites. Now it turns out the only way today to manage the chaos of passwords, I think I've got about 300. Could I remember those? The only way to do it is with a password manager. And of course, when you start looking at this, you discover the first thing is that the vast majority of people don't use a password manager. Now in this audience, my guess is going to be that half of you do. I don't know, let's take a poll. How many of you use a password manager? It's more than half. That's very, very nice. I don't know how anyone would survive without it, but a lot of people do. Now, I'm going to start with some of the problems with passwords. So these problems that I'm talking about on this chart are in fact all solvable today with password managers. If the majority of people use password managers, those problems would either be gone away or they'd be mitigated. So weak passwords, people choose them so they can remember them. A Deloitte study 2013 found that they looked at 6 million passwords, and they found that the 10,000 of those passwords that were most used would access 98% of the accounts. So you rank all the passwords, the 10,000 that occurred the most did all but 2% of accounts. It could open them up. Pretty scary, right? That's massive reuse. So users are routinely reusing passwords and usernames, of course, because usernames are often email addresses. They store them in text files, they write them down, they email them to themselves, they share them with other people. Users are subject to phishing, social engineering, keyloggers on their devices. Now, all of these password managers would help with, but the fact is people are not using them. They have a sense something's wrong, but they're just not using them. There's a bit of a chicken and egg. In fact, there's quite a bit of a chicken and egg. Until users all have password managers, or the majority do, service providers cannot insist on long, complex passwords. And until service providers insist on long, complex passwords, most users who are lazy, quite frankly, in their computing are not going to go get themselves a password manager. So we're stuck. It's simply not going anywhere. Now, some other issues with passwords. A lot of service providers don't manage passwords well. Thankfully, this thing's going away, but some of them still collect passwords over HTTP. And some of them still collect passwords for third-party sites using, by directly collecting user IDs and passwords. They should be using OAuth. A lot of them still aren't. Now, in the enterprise space, one of the big things you're going to run into is, you probably have run into, is shared accounts and the issues that causes, especially with offboarding. So a lot of accounts have more than one person using the credentials. When the people leave, companies should be changing those credentials. Do they? Oftentimes not. Now, help desks cost a lot of money to run, and a lot of those help desk calls are actually for password changes. There was a study by Mandiant Labs just this year. Average enterprise spends $180,000 on password resets for every 1,000 users. $180,000 for every 1,000 users. And on average, about 20 to 50% of all the calls to the help desk were to reset passwords. So with the problems, why are passwords still being used? There's a lot of advantages to them. They worked for about 50 years, and for users, they're pretty easy to understand. Users have no challenge at all. You don't need any special hardware. You simply walk up to anything in the world today and you can log into your account. It may not be safe to do that, but you can do it. It's easy to change your password to revoke the account. If you forget your email, you simply request a link through email. You've got a new link to log in. And it's very easy on the other side for the service providers to implement. Every language has libraries, to implement password systems. There's also economics. I find in any space, not security, I mean everywhere, it's really fun to look at the incentives that are making things the way they are. Now, here you can see essentially a tragedy of the commons, or in economics that's called a negative externality, it turns out. There's many types of market failures. A negative externality is one of those types of market failures. If you're interested in economics like I am, I encourage you to go read all the flavors of market failures. Quite interesting. So a negative externality is when two parties are in a transaction and some third party is being hit with some negative benefits. So they're not involved in the transaction, but they're still being impacted by it. So in password security, you find that low-value sites have no incentive at all to improve the security of their authentication systems. So when there's breaches, let's say their password files are stolen, it's the high-value sites that are impacted because people reuse passwords and user IDs. So the high-value sites get hit by kind of drive-by shootings in a sense. The low-value sites have no cost at all because their stuff's not of high value. And you find that, okay, yeah, that's enough. I'm doing pretty well. I've got 12 minutes down and 10 charts down. So I don't have to rush quite as much as I thought I might need to. So I'm going to start with the issues. What are passwords? So passwords are a shared secret. Now shared secrets can be good and bad. In the case of passwords, good and bad. Where do you see passwords? Most people think about passwords as the logins for all their accounts. So their web accounts, they think of those passwords. But there's other places too where passwords occur. So equally important, and in fact, you could argue it's more important because it gets less attention, and I'll talk more about this, is account recovery. So account recovery uses a variety of mechanisms. I'll talk a lot more about this, but passwords are clearly one of those. You would know those passwords as challenge response or security answers and questions or recovery one-time passwords. All of those are essentially passwords. Now, there's also master passwords. People call them master passwords for things like password managers. So it's kind of a meta password. It's not a password to a simple account. It's an account that gives you access to passwords for a lot of accounts. And of course, there's device passwords. There's your computer password, your phone password. So passwords are one form of authentication factor. What are some of the other forms? So you all know MFA and authentication, know, have, and are. So have can be hardware or software. You've got mobile devices, smart cards, and then on the software side, you've got seeds for your TOTP devices, software, and hardware in the old days, and certificates. And then what you are typically comes down to biometrics, and I'll talk a lot more about this as well. Fascinating subject. So everything you can imagine about your body has already been or will become a biometric. And people are now adding additional factors like location and more to come. So biometrics are definitely all the rage, and I guess it probably started with smartphones. So I've tried to come up with a way to categorize biometrics. It's my own personal way of doing it. I'm sure there's many ways of breaking them down. But I've tried to think about the risks, the relative risks of the different types of biometrics. So I've broken it down into into 4 different categories. So contact is where you actually have to be at the person in order to measure the thing, to record it. So fingerprint and DNA are really good examples of those. Things that can be done at a distance, kind of more interesting, right? Selfie photos, selfie videos, even your iris scans could be done at a distance. Visible pulse on your skin can be done from video filming. Very interesting stuff. Persistent things. So fingerprints and DNA hangs around. Everywhere you go, you leave your fingerprints and your DNA. And there's more things to come, kind of science fiction a few years ago, but people are starting to do them. Invasive. So invasive meaning it kind of affects your body. So you swallow something, you implant something, or you can tattoo something, and there's more. So one of the issues with biometrics is that they are slowly, in some instances at least, replacing passwords. It's Touch ID on my phone. A lot of the times I turn my phone on and use it, it doesn't ask for a password, it asks me for Touch ID. There's Windows Hello, RealSense cameras. So it raises a really important question that I don't think is adequately dealt with. And that question is, are biometrics more like passwords, or are they more like user IDs? So I want to ask you guys, how many of you think a biometric, various kinds, more like passwords? How many of you think more like user IDs? Okay, could you all come up here and do the presentation? Okay, all right. So I see I'm preaching to the choir, very nice. So the issues with the biometrics, they're easy to steal, and you can use them without the owner of the biometrics being aware of them. That's a big deal. So persistent and remote type biometrics in my taxonomy there, those can all be done. They can all be stolen and used without your knowledge. And of course, even with your knowledge, one or more governments probably have your biometrics. How certain are you that that data is really safe with them? Biometrics can be fooled. So iris scanning can be fooled by photographs if it's not well done. Fingerprint verification with Play-Doh, and there's stories about people when they're drunk, sleeping, having their fingers used on their phones. So the point is that biometrics are a lot more public than passwords. You don't go around telling people your passwords, at least most normal people don't. But biometrics, you spray them around essentially. So if you look at a spectrum, passwords on the one hand are quite private, user IDs very public, biometrics somewhere in the middle, a very interesting, hard to define space in the middle. Most importantly, I think, is that you can change your passwords, but you can't change your biometrics. If your service provider has a breach, or you lose your password, whatever, you can just change it. If you lose your DNA, if you lose your iris scans, if you lose your fingerprints, and I would argue they're already gone, then you can't change those. They're yours for life unless you believe in too much science fiction. So I would say the conclusion is that biometrics are a factor of authentication, but they cannot be relied on entirely and cannot be fully trusted either. So I'm going to try an experiment here. I hope this works. So there's this really cool clip, and let me just do this a simple way. I will extend. Can you see that? Oh, sorry, duplicate. Okay, so I want to set the scene. A mind share has just happened, or has it? Here we go.
You check his ID number, check his personal ID number, only the cameras would know that.
I'm gathering that you probably didn't hear a single word of that. Am I right? Let's do this again. All right, so I have to tell you what happened. So a mind share, did it happen or not? You've got to prove whether it's you or not you. Biometrics don't work after a mind share because you've got somebody else's body, right? Or the body has somebody else's mind. Big, long password, master password. Okay. That would have worked better if you could have heard it. So an important consideration for passwords, for biometrics, especially for a few different types of authentications, is the local versus remote dichotomy. So the key point is what's appropriate for local and what's appropriate for remote authentication. So locally, if you're talking to your computer, your phone, what's appropriate? And I would argue that when it's a local authentication, it's okay to use what I would call unstrong methods. A password, biometric. Those are things that are very useful for authenticating you either fully or somewhat, but they must not leave your device. You should not be sending passwords across the network. You should not be sending biometrics across the network. If you have any interest in this subject, I'll point you to the Global Identity Foundation, their Principles of Identity 3.0, principle number 8, talks about biometrics. Fascinating stuff. If you get into identity, you'll be spending a long time reading. It's really fun. So remote or cloud, on the other hand, I would argue you need strong methods. You should be using methods based on public key crypto. Should not be sending biometrics, should not be sending passwords across the network. Now, how do you mitigate passwords? Passwords have a lot of faults. You can mitigate them. You can replace them. So I'm going to start with some of the simpler ways. So on devices, there's biometrics that can partially replace passwords. So you know that. Your phone sometimes asks you for a password, most of the time asks you for biometrics. The biometrics are meaning that you don't have to use your password quite as often, and it lets you use essentially a longer password if you want to. Now, two-factor authentication, passwords, with two-factor authentication, you can essentially reduce the strength of the password. With two-factor authentication, you are able to have an additional factor, therefore you don't need as strong a password. Now, some of the ways of doing this, TOTP, you can fish them in real time though, as the previous speaker just mentioned. There's out-of-band, aka mobile push, and there's FIDO UTF, universal second factor, which is based on a hardware token and public key crypto. Very nice stuff. Something coming up is called by a few different names. So I've chosen to call it adaptive continuous authentication. It started out as risk-based authentication. It's also called behavioral, and any combination of the words I've just stated. So the whole idea of adaptive is that you're looking at the risk of the action being done and the risk of the actor of that action. And continuous means not only when you log into your device, your computer, the whole time you're using it, you're continuously being evaluated for risk factors. So essentially, your device, the cloud potentially, has sensors that are being used to collect risk-type information and make decisions in real time. Banks started out with risk-based authentication in this. So there's a few different flavors. The bank one I mentioned, that's primarily cloud-based. There's local-based, and then there's a combination of local and cloud. And Google Trust API is something interesting to look at. It's a risk-based system. So with passwords, you can easily hide them today using password managers and using something called, by a few names, but secure web authentication, a type of password manager built into some SSO systems. SSO, secure web authentication, is not SAML. I'll talk about that a bit later. So if you really want to stop sharing passwords, and sharing, I mean between sites. So I mentioned before the need to authenticate or to gain access to resources on a third-party site. So OAuth lets you do that. In the old days, your site that wanted to post to your Facebook page would collect your user ID and password. Not such a great idea, because then they've got it too, and they can misuse it, they can lose it. OAuth fixes that. And OAuth is really, I would say, one of the marvels of the universe. And if you ever have a chance of using it, you definitely should. And anybody who is still collecting credentials should definitely move to OAuth type systems. Now, a complete replacement, some of you will definitely recognize these. How many of you have ever played with client certificates? Okay. So client certificates have been around a really long time. They have a long history. They're a form of public key crypto. They're essentially the reverse of a server certificate. So normally, you care about who the server is, and you only want to go to that server if through TLS if it's the right server. Client certificates are the reverse. The server cares about who you are, and the server knows who you are and whether you should have access. They're a fantastic idea, in my opinion. I've never actually played with one. My understanding is the issues with server-side, with client certificates, essentially bad user experiences for managing the certs. So certs, they interact with browsers, with operating systems, with multiple devices. And then around the issues, these days, I've got 4 different devices I use for various things. I want everything to work seamlessly amongst those devices. How do you do that with client certificates? Now, I got to thinking, I've been thinking about this for a little while, and I've seen this a few other places, a couple of other places on the web, people thinking the same ideas, but it hasn't been pursued. What if everyone had a password manager? Would my password manager be able to manage my client certificates and sync them between devices, store them securely, as easily for my client certificates as it does for my passwords? I think it might. However, I wouldn't put money on this. I think TLS certificates have probably passed their opportunity window. So replacing passwords, we'll keep going. I'm going to talk about how authentication can be pushed from passwords to other things. And in this case, hardware things. So hardware tokens have been around for a while in the form of smart cards. TOTP tokens, those old secure ID things, I'm pretty sure every single one of you, if you're old enough, at one point was carrying one around. I certainly did. And now more recently, FIDO UTF tokens. So UTF token is client server and really nicely secure. There's also increasingly smart devices doing this. You no longer need a piece of hardware. Your phones, your watches, your tablets, your NIMI bands. The really important thing is that you've now got something in your pocket that used to be the special piece of hardware. And this opens up the door for all sorts of new authentication things. Now, I want to talk a little bit about trusted computing. Trusted computing started out with things like TPM chips, and it's moved on to mobile devices like Secure Enclave on Apple, and I forget what it's called on Google. The idea is that there's this little hardened processor in your computer, your phone, which stores your keys and protects them from the bad world and also protects them from you. So it's this kind of intelligent thing, has its own mind in a sense, storing your keys and enabling you to do secure public-private key type protocols. This is a really key. Increasingly, all high-value or high-end devices have secure computing, and it really changes things. So moving on to replacing passwords with software. this is quite interesting. So in the consumer space, you might have heard of OpenID Connect. It's gone through a few flavors. Started with OpenID, then moved to OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is a combination of OpenID and OAuth. So the idea being that you've got, you know what maybe a social login. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Yahoo, all of these are pushing this because they all want to be your portal to the rest of the web. So they're doing you a favor in the sense you've only got one set of credentials to lose and to manage, but they're also trying to grab you into their ecosystem. Now in the enterprise space, SAML is the big winner, so security assertion markup language. It's very much like OpenID Connect, but enterprise space, and enables you, how many of you use SAML, or SSO I should say, in enterprise? I would have expected more. Okay, so it's fantastic. My company has it, amazing thing. Log in once and your 100 services or more are all off the same credentials. Now FIDO UAF, Universal Authentication Framework, is software as well. It's in the same suite of protocols as FIDO's U2F. And you can look at it a little bit like SSO in your pocket. Your device lets you log into a bunch of services with kind of pre-stored keys. And an issue though is how do you do this between different devices? So you've authenticated one phone. Does your tablet work automatically? Account recovery, I alluded to this before. It's a pet peeve of mine, and it's something that is a mess in my opinion, and it gets not nearly enough attention. So today, as nearly as I can figure, the best thing you can do for account recovery is to answer all those security questions with completely fake answers and store those completely fake answers that are long and random, by the way, in some other completely safe place. Now, how many people do that? Not a hell of a lot. So challenge response, essentially account recovery mechanisms, very hard to manage for users. And users are encouraged, in fact, you know, what's your favorite pet? Dumb idea, right? So as a result, service providers are tending towards preferring recovery using other mechanisms. The other mechanisms they tend towards are email and SMS. Do you think email and SMS are secure? Probably not. So if you compromise the email or SMS, you've now compromised many of the accounts that rely on those mechanisms. NIST, by the way, recently deprecated the use of SMS for multi-factor authentication. What are some of the alternatives to this? In the enterprise, it's probably not a big deal because there's help desks, and help desks, you know, they have ways of authenticating users. In the consumer space, it's a bit more problematic to come up with good solutions. There are some real-world identity verification services, but you've probably never run into them. So you can authenticate with a mail service. So the government of Canada tends to use that for some things. Works well, takes a few days, people don't like that. In Germany, they have the post-ident system where you have to go to a post office to authenticate yourself. And recently, Facebook has created Facebook Delegated Account Recovery, so for GitHub and more things in the future likely. I'll mention that FIDO doesn't cover account recovery, and I want to say that this whole area needs a lot more attention that it's getting, because authentication, you know, everyone looks at that. They don't think about recovery, but recovery can take over your account as easily as bad authentication or lost authentication. So it's pretty obvious passwords aren't perfect. Why are they still hanging around? So a lot of lower risk, lower value sites have simply no incentive to move beyond them. A more kind of positive reason is that for multi-factor authentication, you need multiple factors, and I'm going to argue more and more is good. So something you know is pretty important. You never want to get rid of that something you know as one of the factors in your authentication. So what happens if you cannot use a trusted device for some reason? So you've lost your phone, you have to log into a public terminal, heaven forbid, you have to use a friend's phone, a friend's computer, or you live in part of the world where you have to use a public terminal. Maybe you don't have a cell phone. What do? If you don't have a trusted device, then a device you own that you're reasonably sure you know what's happening to it, then you can't store secrets on the device, for instance. So it's really important in that case to have a fallback and a mechanism of passwords. Now, I do want to mention some privacy concerns as well, not of passwords, but of some of the alternatives. So with SSO, everything is tied back to that identity provider. And that does create privacy concerns. It means that more attention has to be paid to this. So you need to look at schemes sometimes called variable identity. So you can create pseudonyms for some types of services. You can create anonyms. Public key crypto makes this possible. It makes possible all sorts of really cool stuff in identity. Now, where are you still going to need passwords? I indicated you can't get rid of them. You don't want to get rid of them. Where do you still need them? So device passwords. As a fallback to the biometric and underlying the biometric, your device password is really the thing encrypting your phone. It's the biometrics that are kind of a key into that. Now, master passwords as well. Master passwords, password managers, TOTP managers, if you like doing that kind of thing, like auth. There's debate about that, but that's certainly a valid place for a master password. And of course, for SSO, you could argue that the password getting you into your SSO system is kind of like a master password. It's a meta password I talked about, giving you access to multiple passwords. Now, you're essentially moving from a world where you had n passwords, like 300 in my case, maybe a little bit more, to a few passwords. And I want to call those n passwords, I want to call them forgotten passwords. Essentially, they're forgettable, they're forgotten, they're typically bad passwords. With the few good passwords, I want to call those memorized passwords. So they're memorable, you make them memorable, you remember them, you pay attention to them. I think a really key point about the first point, I didn't mention this, but for device passwords, it's really important to recognize that a lot of things in the world are starting to push authentication or delegate it in a sense to your device. They'll happily let you use the device to authenticate the service or second factor, whatever. That means the security of your device is pretty critical. Those services, in a sense, are letting your device choose for you. You need to pay attention to that device. This is my second last slide. So I want to say there's no silver bullet for getting rid of passwords, but you can see that the trends are all going the right direction. So the two trends. Decreasing number of passwords. You're going from one password per account to a couple of master passwords that you guard with your life. Well, not literally. So hardware tokens, smart devices, the UAF of FIDO, not to be confused with U2F, SSO and OAuth, are all things that are going to decrease the number of passwords in your lives. And on the other side, there's a whole bunch of things that are causing you to need to use passwords less often. So password managers are clearly one of those because they hide that complexity from you. TOTP, mobile push, the U2F of FIDO, biometrics definitely, and I'll say a bit more on my ultimate slide, and continuous adaptive authentication. As that grows over time, we're still very early, as that grows over time, that'll have a big impact on decreasing number of passwords and asking you password only when it's really important for something critical. So some final thoughts for you. Don't over-rely on biometrics. Don't treat biometrics as an absolute truth. They are very far from that. And don't misuse them. Don't send them across a network. Don't store them in a database somewhere. Bad ideas. They're very much okay on your device, on your computer, stored locally in something you control, but don't send them across the network. Account recovery, definitely pay more attention to this. It's really important that all aspects of authentication of a service be balanced, not only the login portion, but also the recovery at the back end. Now for businesses, I want to encourage you to not allow users to use dumb passwords. Now what's a dumb password? It's certainly one of the top 1,000 most used passwords, and I'd argue even the most 10,000 most used passwords would bad choices as well. It's great if you can block users from choosing those passwords and also block them from choosing otherwise weak passwords, like too short, for instance. Now, for the industry as a whole, I talked about incentives before. I would love to come up with a way to create incentives for the use of password managers. I'm not saying password managers are a solution to everything, but today, given the technology today deployed, given the critical mass and the weight of all the websites in use, password manager is the best you can do today to manage the complexity for users. How do you get to a point where users want to use a password manager? If you can figure that one out, you should go buy stock in the password managers and go work for them. I haven't figured it out. If you have any thoughts in the coffee break, I would love to hear them. And then the other side of this, essentially, how do you create disincentives for dumb passwords, for companies allowing people to use dumb passwords? How would you encourage all sites to disallow dumb passwords, weak passwords? And even more importantly, how would you ever create a way of preventing reuse of passwords? If you could create a system that would prevent reuse of passwords, you'd be solving a lot of problems. Now, I created one of these myself, it so happens. If you go look for my blog, you'll find it. It's a little bit controversial, but it's definitely a way of doing it. Now, on the government side, governments have a mixed record of doing things. They do good, they do bad. A lot of people in security automatically dislike government intervention, government action. But I want to argue there are some places, like the tragedy of the commons, those market failures, where governments can have a good role to play. So I would like to find, I'd like to see whether there's a role for governments in regulating some aspect of authentication to help solve some of these problems. You can get a little bit of a flavor of some of this kind of thinking. Bruce Schneier's recent blog on his thoughts about the need for regulation in the IoT space. I would encourage you to go read that, and if you're not following Schneier, definitely do. So that's it. That's it for my presentation. I've left a fair bit of time for questions. And let's, don't forget to wait for a microphone, please. Here we go.
I noticed that some of the Canadian banks, for instance, force you to use a particular length password and following a particular format. How on earth could this be beneficial for the user?
So a length, I'll repeat that. So he's saying password cannot be longer than 6, cannot be shorter than 6. That's pretty plain dumb. No idea, never heard of that one. I can't even see. Yeah, there's a lot of legacy things, right? So, oh, can someone give a mic? This is really interesting.
So part of the reason you do that is so that the users don't reuse passwords. If you have a completely different password format, you prevent somebody from using their Facebook password on the bank. security risks that banks face are not password guessing, because like you said, we detect any sort of multiple attempt. So that's not where the hole is, effectively.
Thank you. I'm glad we could get that answered. That's really interesting. So that's trying to work around the problem I was mentioning before, where the vast majority of people out in the real world, not in this room, don't use password managers. Trying to work around that. Quite an interesting solution. My company has a Nerf cube with a microphone in it, and we toss it around to speakers for questioners. Pretty interesting. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm just wondering if we're using password managers, could we not just give people the password instead of saying, make up your own password and then it's going to have your dog's name in it or whatever? Just here's the password that you should use, and it's, 32 characters long and very random.
That's a fantastic question. So you recall I was talking about my thought exercise. What if everyone had a password manager? Could you somehow start using TLS client certs instead of passwords? It would open up all sorts of new ways of looking at things, and this in fact is one of them. Rather than hoping users would choose a long password and complex, you'd give it to them. And of course, it sounds nice, right? I'd love it because I use a password manager religiously. Most users would croak on that, would definitely find another website to use. They'd never go back. So it's part of the chicken and egg that I talked about again. Until you have the critical mass, you can't do these things, and without the critical mass, you can't get there. It's a no-win situation. It requires a bit of intelligent thinking. Any more questions? Yes.
So, this is a literacy issue. As soon as the users can be educated to the ramifications of using weak passwords, they will then be invested in not doing so. So, being able to at least have them partially shoulder the burden of responsibility is the key here. And because this plays such an impactful role across so many different services in our society, then there are a number of different bodies, from organizational to governmental, that can actually help to raise the level of literacy around the need for robust passwords. So why are we kind of, granted we're expecting the users to be lazy or unwilling, et cetera, but that is actually where we can be most impactful instead of trying to enforce some sort of mechanism.
Yes. So did you guys hear that? Yeah, okay. So I'm not very hopeful about the ability to educate users to, or convince them to start using password managers and good password hygiene and good device hygiene and all those things. I honestly don't know how you'd ever do that. You could issue everybody at birth with a little implanted token with their certificate, but that might have problems as well. I can't imagine how you'd ever educate users. I'd love to see that. I've often thought, I talked about government action, I've often thought that government should be doing more to educate people, just like you said. But it's interesting, I'm not aware of any governments that have really done that in any serious way. And I'm not holding my breath. Any more questions?
So this is possibly kind of an edge case in terms of password use, but kind of recently there's been reports of crossing borders into the US where someone will ask you for your Facebook password. So what's the interplay there of like, oh, I have a specific password for Facebook versus let me log into LastPass and get my Facebook password, and it's like, oh no, give me that too so I can look at all of your passwords, and kind of how do you, can you think of that there might be ways to mitigate those circumstances?
That's a really interesting one. You guys probably all know, I read every single article I can find about border crossings and impacts and troubles. The big thing to remember to border crossing is you have very few rights, at least in the short term. So to do that, yes, very interesting question. if you tell the guy, I can't log into Facebook, I don't remember the password, oh, log into your password manager, no problem. However, there is another way. Luckily, there are cookies left on your mobile device, hopefully, so that you can get into Facebook without having to re-authenticate. So make sure you're authenticated to Facebook before you cross the border, and more importantly, make sure you don't get called into secondary screening. That I don't see any more questions. Oh, okay, there is one.
So some of the discussion makes me think of No Child Left Behind, because some people don't really want to use internet services. That's not me, but you know, when internet banking came on, I was right onto it. But not everybody is like that. So you're talking about kind of getting critical mass and things like that for better proactive measures. I mean, client-side certificates been around for forever. But I don't know. Maybe it's just a comment, like, good luck with that. Because not everybody has planned to use the services that they've been given or need to use, right?
Yes, so I do know one person in the world who has no internet services. It's my mother. Oh, I lied. Actually, she has email now because I set it up for her, but that's it. Her iPad has no password. She wouldn't know how to log into a website if her life depended on it. But other people, I'd say, on the whole, people are slowly getting into it. I think it's really important to not forget all the privacy issues. As technology goes forward, the world goes forward, privacy tends to fall by the wayside. You want to find solutions that enable privacy. I mentioned before, I think I touched on it very briefly, troubles with SSO, for instance. The identity provider is always tying things back to you. I'm guessing that even in 100 years with technology that none of us can fathom, I'm guessing there's going to be passwords still to access, you know, certain types of dark web-ish type accounts that you want to have no ability for anyone to tie to anything. I don't think passwords are going away. I think that they will always have some kind of value, both kind of on the privacy enhancing side and on the side of enhancing just the other factors. I think that may be it. Oh, one more, okay.
You seem to be a big proponent of the password managers, and I'm not against them. I have lots of clients who use them, and they're definitely better than nothing. Personally, I'm a bit of a dinosaur, so the whole threat of having a single point of failure has kept me away from them in my own use, because over the years I've developed sort of a rolling password algorithm that I found that works really well, and I'm happy with it, and I just haven't made the jump. So my question is, can you convince me, as someone who sort of knows what's going on, is a password manager better than whatever system that I've got that, I can't teach all users to use. So, for those people, yeah, absolutely use a password manager. But, my wife, all the people who are close to me, I've taught them to use decent algorithms and how to, keep them non-guessable, even if somebody gets a decent sample of them. Is that better, or should I still be looking more seriously into a password manager?
So I want to be clear. Password managers are not the be-all, end-all, but I think today they're the best we're going to do for the vast majority of cases and users. So that being the case, I didn't touch on in my presentation something that kind of underlies my thinking on a lot of subjects, and it's the word resilience. And resilience means that no matter what happens, you can kind of come back from it. And in the case of password managers, you want to keep in mind resilience as well as privacy, obviously, and security. So password managers, you want to look for one that's zero knowledge. And if you don't know what zero knowledge is, pretty interesting concept. The idea is that everything is encrypted at your end. Only time it ever gets to the network is after it's been encrypted, and the keys for that encryption don't get to the network either. So any good password manager today, the big ones, they're all zero knowledge. Very, very important. If anyone walks into their data centers takes all the hard drives off and spends a lot of time trying to decrypt them, they're not going to get anything. And from resilience point of view, so that speaks to protection, essentially, of your information. The risks then are not at the server side, they're not the service side, assuming it's properly implemented. And a lot of those companies do bug bounties and stuff. The risks are at your device. And in fact, in security, the risks are usually at the end device. And from resilience point of view, putting stuff in the cloud increases your resilience. And that's true with any service, really. There's obviously issues to be addressed, but the cloud gives you resilience. And my passwords are synced between all my devices. If one of my devices doesn't work, I can go to the other one to help recover that device, fix it. While I was preparing this presentation, my home computer crapped out totally. We're talking it wouldn't respond to Control-Alt-Delete. What the hell? So I needed my recovery password for BitLocker, because what paranoid security guy wouldn't use BitLocker? How did I get that recovery password? Pull up my phone. It's there through my password manager. That gives me resilience, gives me the ability to come back from issues with computing and environments. And I can also, of course, use it offline as well. If the cloud goes down, my devices keep working with my password manager. There's a question here.
Yeah, I think one of the important things is that you don't necessarily use the same set of recovery mechanisms, that you treat all of your data and your passwords differently. So your Bitcoins would be recoverable in a different way than your login at work or on a website. Certain things might be stored in a password manager. Other things you might store a key that you can use to decrypt a printed password that you keep around. And you keep the second half of that at your mom's house.
Yes, indeed. That goes to resilience. The more knowledgeable you are about IT and security in general, I would argue the more forms of backup you have of all things, not only your data, but your passwords, your keys, your tokens. And indeed, you don't want to rely on any one thing. If you have multiple ways to back things up, you're better off. Of course, you've now increased the probability of losing any one of those things or using them so infrequently you forget how they work or they've stopped working. But it's always a trade-off. Resilience is very important. I would argue you should always consider that in anything you do, including authentication. Going once, going twice, sold. Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.